team. I will go ahead and kick us off here. My name is Taylor Brown. So excited for today's presentation. If you've been on the other sessions with us, welcome back to the Future of QMS Requirements True Quality Summit series. We have a very special guest with us here for the next hour to give us a sneak peek into the future of the FDA's QSMR. So the session we have today will run for about 35 minutes. We will leave some time for questions at the end. So if any questions do come up, go ahead and throw those in the Q&A. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A and the chat as we're going. And we will get to as many questions as possible. We are joined by Deepa Pandya, who works at the Medical and Healthcare Services in TÜV Süd and is the technical lead auditor for medical devices and as a non-active devices auditing department manager. So I love auditing. Deepa, I'm assuming you love auditing as well. She, along with her team of auditors and client managers, serve as a point person for many clients to support their conformity assessment needs alongside TÜV Süd. Deepa began her career in industry working in R&D after graduating from the University of Minnesota with her doctorate. She has about 15 years of hands-on experience developing devices and experience in medical device from a concept to a finished product leading towards compliance. Keeping up with changing regulations in the industry has by far been the most challenging for her to keep up with, but probably the most interesting, I would assume, as well. And I think that's why we're here to talk about today. So Deepa, I will go ahead and pass it over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Taylor. Appreciate that. We get started. The discussion topic for today is FDA's proposal for updated QMS regulation. They're calling it QMS regulation as a title change. The interesting part about this is the effort that FDA has had towards harmonizing to global standards, along with the work that they've been doing using those international standards to incorporate in other aspects of their work. Today's topic is interesting because it's an interpretation of TÜV Süd's experts on FDA's proposal. By any means, we will try our best to give you an understanding of where we think this is going, where it's coming from, and based on what has been published, what can we expect the impact to be in the future for manufacturers? So we go to the next slide. Today's agenda, I'll be talking about what FDA's intention is with this proposal and where you can find the proposed document. I'll be then moving towards giving you a brief background on FDA's QMSR, what FDA's connection has been with ISO 13485 2016 international standard, a brief history on the standard itself, and then we'll move into talking about what FDA's goals were when they developed or evolved their quality management system requirements into this QMSR. Then we get into the technical piece, which is a little bit more to do with the nitty-gritties and the details that the proposal covers under key modifications. From there, we move on to how this implementation is been proposed to be spread through the coming months and years, and what it is that is going to be the impact from a standpoint of auditing and inspections for FDA. Just a quick slide on timelines and major takeaways, and then we'll move into quick Q&A. I also have 2 pages of resources where we've collected different aspects of input from sites, and hopefully that will serve to be a good backbone in case you have additional questions that I may not be able to fully provide support with. So with that, we'll move into the meat of the presentation. FDA's intention. Well, FDA's intention with the revision was to not do an overhaul per se of their QMS, but to do it by incorporating references to the ISO 13485. 21 CFR Part 820 has additional requirements when it comes to what is required by manufacturers to address with medical devices to get into market, but these are above and beyond the ISO 13485 requirements. So there is a little bit of an indication that there is going to be additional requirements to the ISO 13485. It won't be just a standalone compliance document per se. There's going to be additional things that we would have to do from 820. So we go into a brief of all of those activities too. Then we talk about where FDA's proposal is coming from. They wanted to do this conformity edits as well to meet sort of the evolutionary needs of the regulatory world. So that is something that they're also proposing in this document. Overall, they hope to keep record keeping on a down low and reduce burden for device manufacturers. With the proposed regulation, I have a screenshot from the FDA's website of what that looks like. It's a huge document, but gives you a good idea of what it looks like when you do arrive at that page, and the link to this proposal. Hopefully, this is going to be an interesting read for those who are actively involved with industry activities. But so here it is. We'll move into the details of this and see how best we can slice and dice it and make sense of the information provided. Next slide, please, Taylor. Thank you. All right. This is where I talk about sort of a background on where ISO 13485 is, how does it play an important role. And this is going to lead into FDA's 21 CFR history, as well as FDA's involvement with international standards and risk assessment. ISO 13485 2016 version is the latest one. It is a standard that establishes requirements for quality management systems that organizations can use, irrespective of what portion of a device life cycle they are providing a service for in the community. QMS principles that are presented in this standard, ISO 13485, have very sort of detailed ties with the risk management process that is detailed in ISO 14971. This is one thing that is sort of a little different from how FDA presents 21 CFR 820. 820 has two major references to risk management, but with this move, this is going to serve as a more integrated approach to risk management activities for all manufacturers. From a comparison perspective, there are many similarities between ISO 13485 and 21 CFR Part 820. Some of the attractions of ISO 13485 is the fact that it has incorporated really elegantly global regulatory requirements in it, and the compliance towards the standard globally has been increasing over the years. Partly because this particular standard offers a certain level of flexibility to different organizations to accommodate the standard when they're establishing their QMS to meet their needs and to meet the requirements from a risk perspective to the different regulatory requirements that geographies present across the globe. So those are sort of the high level attractions of this standard. And one of the reasons for it to be longstandingly accepted for various programs, which you will see in the next slide. So we'll go into the next slide and talk about FDA and the connection to ISO 13485. It's interesting to kind of note because there is aspects of this rollout that will make sense from a standpoint of the other ways that FDA performs inspections. So FDA has not changed 820 for a very long time. The first edition came out in 78, and then significant revisions were made in 96. Since 96, the changes have happened on the ISO 13485 front, where first edition came out, and then 2003 we had the second one, and then now in 2016 we recently had the third iteration of ISO 13485. During this time, FDA has developed something called as a Global Harmonization Task Force. This task force has been actively participating in various regulatory activities, including providing guidance on implementation of risk management principles and activities with quality management system with the 14978 Society. They've also participated in other international globalized harmonization efforts. Significant adoption by FDA of the standard has been primarily in the inspection area. PMAP, which is the pilot multi-program audit program, was something that was initiated in 2006. It's no longer used, but was very effectively adopted by Health Canada and FDA for a very long period of time. They since moved from PAMP, which was based on ISO 13485 principles, to the Voluntary Audit Report Submission Program, where again, there was reliance to ISO 13485, where it was accepted a way of audit reports in lieu of routine FDA surveillance audits that were being performed. And after that, since 2016's edition came out, there was a significant effort from FDA's side and 4 other countries to come up with the MDSAP audit program, which is the Medical Device Single Audit Program. This program also is based on ISO 13485 principles. What FDA did do at that point of time is to develop very significant country-specific requirements to tie in with the MDSAP program. And those play a very important role, at least in our day-to-day work, where with the MDSAP program, we meet the requirements of ISO 13485, but cover country-specific requirements for the 5 countries participating in this program individually, as and when those are presented from a gap perspective by these countries to us. At this point, FDA took on the incorporation of ISO 13485, which was in 2018, and then since then put into writing a proposal that came out February this year. And that proposal is what we're discussing today. FDA did hold a public advisory committee meeting in March. These meeting minutes have been published on FDA's website and are an interesting read from a panel response perspective and interpretation perspective of this QMSR. So does make for an interesting read. So this is sort of an overview and a background to Part 820 and high-level interactions with the ISO 13485 standard. We move on to the next slide, please, and talk about what FDA plans to achieve with this proposed QMSR. We discussed in the initial slide that the goal is to reduce sort of the burden that manufacturers need to maintain from a global business perspective without having this harmonization. So this should help that. FDA does plan to maintain a similar level of assurance from a quality management system perspective. They will be, with this proposal, still offering a level of flexibility where certain QMS activities can be delegated. However, there is an expectation that from a standpoint of the responsibility of meeting these requirements that are laid out in ISO 13485 with this QMSR release, is not to be delegated. That is the responsibility that will remain with the manufacturers. The goal that the other goal that FDA proposes to meet is to continue to be able to provide safe and effective devices in the industry, in the market. And that stands to hold. We will go through some of the definitions and sort of interpretations that FDA is asking us to make when we read the QMSR and the ISO 13485 from a standpoint of what safe and effective devices mean, and how ISO 13485 presents it as safe and performing devices. So when we do read that, there is a certain level of interpretation FDA would like us to make, and they hope to achieve that through this goal. The other two pieces of that tie into this goal have to do with something that ISO 13485 is already presenting, which is flexibility from a standpoint of device classification, that QMS establishment can be incorporated by different manufacturers based on what type of device they are providing a service for in the industry. Same with the organizational flexibility. So the essence of these will be something that FDA proposes to maintain through this new release. Next slide, please. All right, let's get into the technical details, the key modifications. The title, of course, is changing. It's going to be called Quality Management System Regulation. The second thing that's changing is that FDA is adding specific requirements with regards to certain concepts that are used in ISO 13485 that were not already present in the 820. And I'll go into some of those details too in the next few slides. They plan to retain the current scope of the regulation. And from an impact to definitions perspective, there is going to be some changes. What FDA is trying to, give me 1 second, please. I kind of, there we go. What FDA has proposed is that they, for the most part, ISO 13485 presents a set of definitions in clause 3 of the document. And those definitions, for the most part, are applicable and acceptable by FDA. They, however, are making some modifications where some definitions that are not covered by ISO 13485 will be either retained or replaced or withdrawn. And FDA makes a good reference to that in the proposed document. A good example could be from a standpoint of how ISO 13485 addresses the establishment or the manufacturer versus how FDA does it. So there will be some clarity coming to us from that point of view. There's also certain level of clarity that they're going to be providing from a standpoint of adoption. FDA has in 820 listed management with executive responsibility versus top management that is used in the two standards. So there will be some clarity to align those definitions and responsibilities. So that is something to watch out for and to see if quality management systems that are currently established still continue to meet those differences or requirements. There is some clarity in the word rework that FDA talks about in the proposed document. They do talk about rework in terms of how they propose to remove the term device master record and incorporate certain other concepts from a standpoint of production, which is process validation versus validation of processes, and what the interpretation of the two are from an ISO 13485 standpoint and 820 standpoint. That clarity should help us get more guidance on how QMS setups should accommodate these definitions or changes in how they are titled. FDA also historically never used the term customer, but with the changing regulatory landscape and the changing economic landscape, where a lot of the activities from a standpoint of the QMS is by some manufacturers outsourced, customer definition changes with that contract manufacturer versus legal manufacturer, or somebody who's getting some services or installation activities performed for a given manufacturer. Those details do require a level of definition for who a customer could be for a given organization. So there is going to be some clarity on that in their definitions moving forward. Some of the other examples I can talk to is also with regards to what FDA details out as a component or a human cell, tissue, cellular level organization, what they deem as verification validation. So those terms we hope to get more clarity on. The other aspects that FDA does allude to in terms of definitions is device labeling and packaging. So there's certainly more to come on that front as to how ISO 13485's requirements for these are laid out versus how FDA is defining them. So that would encompass pretty much a brief into what FDA's proposal is in terms of impact to the current list of definitions that are presented in ISO 13485 versus 820. What in 820 will not be retained, what will be withdrawn, that is, and then what will get modified or clarified further. And some of the definitions that are not in ISO 13485 that are going to stay and will need to be incorporated by manufacturers from 820. So those are a few differences. We go into the next slide. I have a few more slides where we talk about the key modifications. This is an important one from, again, a nitty-gritties perspective, where the devil is in the details. A lot of us like to say that in the regulatory world. If you look at all of 820 and the different subparts, these are the 4 parts that are clearly identified in the proposed document as areas that are going to be different and will need clarity. The equivalent clauses from ISO 13485 is what I'm proposing here. The first one we talk about is quality management system document controls. In here, from a details perspective, what I can talk to you about is actually combining both document controls and records, which is subpart M, is that FDA proposes that quality system records that are not clearly identified in 13485 that FDA would like manufacturers to consider as applicable records is something that they're going to define more clearly. They are referencing quality system records. They're referencing device master records, design history file, and device history record. These are some of the terminologies that are not presented in ISO 13485 that FDA will probably give us a little more guidance on. They are going to incorporate the need for a signature and date on most records, whether they're electronic or not, it doesn't matter. Electronic documents are just are acceptable and signatures are acceptable. So hard copies alone don't form records is something that they're going to provide more clarity on and detail out the acceptance level. MDRs, which is reporting, they are going to retain some of the requirements that are presented in 803 CFR Part 803. So they're going to integrate that as a reference when ISO 13485 reference is going to come out to say that this is something that manufacturers are going to have to do in addition to ISO 13485. And that is to maintain certain level of details in complaints and servicing activities. So that is something that is detailed in subpart N in the current document. And then the proposed is going to be detailed in 820.35 and 45. Besides that, UDI recorded in production records is going to stay. It is not something that ISO 13485 covers. There is a certain level of confidentiality that FDA is going to continue to meet, that it does discuss in its proposal. This is in accordance with 21 CFR Part 20 that FDA currently follows. They plan to continue to do that. So with that, there is a clarity provided in the proposed document that if this rule is finalized, manufacturers must meet ISO 13485 requirements that are called out in clause 4.2.5. But in addition, they also need to meet 820.35 requirements. So we're hoping to get more clarity on what that level of detail is going to be that we're going to have to incorporate in our MDRs moving forward, and what auditors would have to be looking for. So that covers pretty much a very high level overview of what documents and records should cover. I'll dive very quickly into label and packaging differences. And then hopefully we can go through the rest of the slides pretty quickly here. This is the meat of the document and the differences. So I'd like to spend a few more minutes here. It's details, but just bear with me here. Labels and packaging, clause 7.5.1 of ISO 13485 says that the defined operations for label and packaging shall be implemented. However, FDA's Part 820 also requires that there is a certain level of verification that a manufacturer does. ISO 13485 doesn't do that. So that is going to be a difference, and manufacturers are going to have to comply to 13485 and continue to include verification. And so that's not going away. There is also a proposal to retain sort of the controls for labels and packaging, so that there would be adequate speed to recalls. So that we're hoping that FDA will give us additional requirements and guidances that they allude to in the proposed document. So that's high level what packaging and labeling requirements are. I've already referenced the servicing requirements that the manufacturer must maintain certain additional pieces of information that they list out in 820.35 in their servicing records, besides what ISO 13485 clauses require. So with that, we'll go into the next slide, please. Now, this is with the term applicable regulatory requirements in ISO 13485. If one reads that document, there are several mentions of what it means to of applicable regulatory requirements. We are hoping, like MD-SAP, there is additional country-specific requirements. FDA would, in 820 Part 10, detail out additional applicable regulatory requirements for their geography, and would be something that we would do in addition to ISO 13485 and still maintain compliance with 820. Now, excuse me, just going to go mute. I'm recovering, so sorry for that. All right. Risk management is the other area of modifications. It appears like that. However, there must be some level of clarity we should give. 820, the essence has always been that risk management is integrated, but it may not be that obvious because FDA does make a reference to risk management in just two areas of 820, and that is in the CAPA process as well as the design validation process. ISO 13485 has a big difference where they pretty much integrate risk management all the way from clause 4 through the entire document. So it's very integrated. FDA plans to retain that, and they don't plan to move away from it. They, in fact, would like us to understand that this is reinforced, and the intent has always been there in the proposed document. Design control requirements, this is not a change. This is something that they're saying is just clarification, which is that there is going to be a list of provisions where certain class 1 devices will need to follow design controls. And so we're hoping that that clarity will take care of some of the years of confusion that certain manufacturers have had and regulatory agents have had with regards to class 1 and how provisions are managed. So more to come on that. Class 2 and all class 3, no changes there. All design control requirements are applicable. Traceability requirements. There's a big difference there. ISO 13485 lists out additional details for traceability when it comes to implantable devices. FDA, however, has a difference there. They would like us to continue to maintain traceability for all life-sustaining devices. And so there's going to be additional clarity there and definitions around it that will help us clearly identify deviation from ISO 13485 and apply clause number 7.5.9.2, which is traceability, to life-sustaining devices, not just implantable active devices. All right, so that will move to the next slide. FDA plans to give us a little bit more clarification on what, how to interpret the term manufacturer, how to sort of document or understand or construe the ISO 13485 terminology of safety and performance. FDA would like us to constantly think of not just safety and performance, but to construe it as safety and effectiveness of the medical device when we do read the QMSR. So that is a clarification they've provided. And then when it comes to validation of processes, they truly mean process validation, production process validations. So those are some of the clarifications they proposed in this document. There is some additional detail that still retains, which is to do with combination devices. And then they talk about how if between now and when this QMSR becomes official, if there are any edits to ISO 13485, they plan to revisit and modify and update the QMSR. So that is what I have for key modifications. We can move to the next slide. In the next few minutes, I will go through very high level what FDA is going to need to do internally to implement this QMSR. The biggest change for them is going to be their IT infrastructure to accommodate ISO 13485, and so that they can align to this standard. There's going to be significant training involved of FDA staff so that those who are responsible for assessing compliance are trained to ISO 13485. They do mention in their proposal that there is going to be significant effort towards developing inspection technique and or modifying or changing the QSIT that they have in place right now and are following. They do clarify that a QSIT that will be performed after the QMSR is released does not automatically grant us certification for 13485, but that it is just a method of inspection that FDA is going to be implementing. They have a bunch of internal documents that they plan to revise. Communication and education to stakeholders is something that they're focusing on as well during this effort. And then rulemaking is going to be a big effort. Other impacts to FDA will be certain clarities on pre-market and post-market programs, but there is more guidance that we await from FDA on this front. Next slide, please. So key timelines and takeaways for all of us is that the changes will likely result in a transition period of a few years. They're referencing 1 year for now from the final rule in the federal registration or register. There is significant timeline between now till a TIR is released, where there is going to be a clear comparative analysis between the ISO 13485-2016 standard and its clauses with 820. So high level, that's what our takeaways are proposed. Next slide, please. I think this is it. Any questions? I'd like to open it up.
Absolutely. Well, we have a few questions already, but if you have not submitted a question, go ahead and submit that now in the Q&A. And I just saw a couple come through, so people were holding on to them. Great presentation there, Deepa. When I'm thinking about this subject, I often think of a Venn diagram. So you have FDA, you have ISO. What is the overlap? There's someone asking if a company complies with ISO 13485, would the company automatically comply with the new QSMR as well, or do you have to go above and beyond from there? What are your thoughts?
Right. So I'd revert back to some of the key differences that we talked about through the presentation, which is that compliance to ISO 13485 for the most part should help you get compliance to 820 or the new QMSR. There are a few key differences. There is going to be the retention of label verification from the old 820. There is additional requirements that we will have to look into from a standpoint of what records cover when it comes to MDR compliance and servicing records. Sure. So that is something that from a Venn diagram perspective, if you look at it, is a small variation. Besides that, I feel that the proposal is drafted in such a way and communicated in such a way that it appears that there's going to be a lot of overlap. And so if one is ISO 13485 compliant, there are very few pieces of additional work that manufacturers are going to have to do to be compliant to 820 or the QMSR.
Mm-hmm. It feels like the core requirements are there, and it's yes. Really just taking the differences rather than the similarities and focusing on those a bit. Perfect.
Right.
think this is a good question here. So Sandra is asking, how will the FDA handle update revisions to ISO 13485 and ISO 14971? Since that the diagram got a little closer. She said standards usually allow 3 years for compliance. The FDA does not. Will there be recognition of associated technical reports, such as 24971?
The anticipation is that yes, FDA, if there is going to be a evolution of one of these standards, there is going to be additional consideration, is what they're communicating. There is going to be a transition period. In addition to FDA revisiting their TIR and telling us if there is going to be an impact of those changes or evolution of those documents on the QMSR. So like any change, there's going to be a gap analysis. We are expecting FDA to do a thorough analysis. We're expecting that gap to be communicated to everybody. And with it comes a few guidance documents. So we're expecting that to come through, and FDA is communicating the same.
Perfect. In regards to risk specifically, can you speak to possible impacts of embracing 14971s, maybe in terms of records or process that may enforce expectations the FDA previously didn't have? So there were only a few references to risk in the current 820. So
yes,
how is more risk going to impact us moving forward?
I think this is a very small subset of the industry that's going to get impacted by this.
Okay.
Majority of the industry, well, if you look at it from a globalization perspective, pretty much ISO 13485 has been globally harmonized or accepted standard. FDA's 820 compliance only companies are very small, very, very small.
Yes.
So there's already adoption of risk management in all aspects of QMS. It's not just records or documentation, it's everywhere. Clients use risk management not just from a product perspective, but also from a QMS perspective. Mm-hmm. There's going to be a lot of sort of adoption of that in, say, non-conformance reports management or CAPA management or complaints management, where different records or different incidences are going to be further classified based on their own adoption of risk to QMS and to business and to safety and effectiveness of the device based on that event. That is not changing as such from a standpoint of 13485. QMSR alone, I doubt I've come across any company that is only following 820.
Yeah. I was
right?
gonna say you're probably already doing it at some
yes,
point.
You're probably already doing it. What you're probably not in the mindset of is detailing it out, because we don't live and breathe 820 every day. It could be a little bit of an exercise to kind of go through what 820 or QMSR is going to require, and then how 13485 is adopted in your QMS. So that's probably a mindset change that you have to take to point out those differences. You're probably already doing it. Sure. There's a very small subset of companies that I can think of that will have a huge overhaul of their QMS because they've only been following 820, and those are very local to United States, I'm guessing, primarily because they are legacy or they have been around complying to that standard and being okay with business needs and not globalizing it or expanding. Right. But if that is going to happen, 13485 is the only way to expand. So they're probably already doing it.
Probably already doing it. I would hope so. And for those companies, like Neva's asking, for maybe someone who was FDA only, now all of a sudden there's ISO 14971. In terms of risk acceptability, are we going to have to go back and require risk reduction as, I guess it would be what, as low as possible or as far as possible?
So risk assessment from a standpoint of design validations has always been there. So it's not that clients are or industry is not familiar with it. 14971 risk methodology is a standardized methodology that exists. And yes, the requirement is that it be as low as possible, and there be adequate risk-benefit analysis to support the arrival to that level of risk mitigation. And that doesn't change as such. So adoption of QMSR is not removing that. It's actually going to require us to enforce it and to follow it and to integrate it further into other aspects of the QMS besides design validations. So it's definitely called out in design validations and CAPA process, but with this new proposal, they hope to, with references to ISO 13485, require every other aspect of QMS also to adopt it.
Okay.
Hope I've answered your question. That one I hope I did.
There's actually a lot of risk questions in the Q&A. I'm pretty impressed. Maybe there are a couple of people who are heating up their lunch at this point, but would you mind going back, and I can go back a slide to talk about the timeline. So when is the QSMR going to be published, and when would the transition start?
That is the aspect where FDA said that they've just taken public opinion now, and they have published what that was, the panel discussion. They are going backwards. Actually, next slide.
There we go. Yep.
Yeah. We're talking about a transition of a few years based on some of the data that is available on FDA's website.
Oh. Do we need to start panicking yet?
No.
Okay.
It's a little bit longer.
We have a little bit
like
longer.
I said, yes, because like I said, Amy is still working with FDA. They're collaborating with FDA to develop the TIR, which is where the comparative analysis will come out between ISO 13485 and the QMSR.
Got it.
So
Great.
there's a little bit time, right? That's our interpretation again. It's to Sud's understanding. It's not coming from FDA. It's just our interpretation of what FDA is published.
Sure. Makes sense. We have a question from David, and I was actually wondering something similar. So he's asking, is there a chance that the changes that FDA is proposing in the QSMR could be confusing for a 13485 and an MD-SAP audit?
No, from a standpoint of MD-SAP audit, because at this time, MD-SAP audit program uses ISO 13485, and there is a good list of additional country-specific requirements from all the 5 countries. There is no FDA with this change or this proposal. They're not changing the essence of 820. That is not what they're proposing. Yeah. What they're proposing is incorporation by reference, meaning that they're going to take, paragraph 820, blah, 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 corresponds to this clause of ISO 13485. But if ISO 13485 doesn't fully cover what 820's specific subclauses, that's where they plan to detail it out as an additional requirement to ISO 13485. So please understand this, that they're not overhauling 820. 820 stays. What they're doing is providing a reference to ISO 13485 and providing additional clarity. So with that, we don't expect MD-SAP to change heavily. What we do expect to change is FDA's own auditing program, which is the QSIT. That QSIT currently is laid out to go in alignment with 820 the way it's presented. They're planning to change that to meet ISO 13485. Is it going to be similar to MD-SAP? Is it going to be like redundant work? I don't think so, because they do talk about how they plan to take lessons learned from all of these other inspection programs that they've been actively involved in to incorporate it in the QSIT. Okay.
I'm going a little random here. Would FDA still conduct a field inspection for a medical device manufacturer with an ISO 13485 certification?
Absolutely. They can do
Stay ready.
They can do that. They can do that. I mean, it doesn't remove inspection away.
Yep.
They do. They will continue to do them, and they have been taking a risk-based approach, and we expect that they will continue to do that. This alignment doesn't take that away.
Exactly. Yep. Will we still need FDA typical documentation structure such as a DHF, DMR, separate from the medical device file that is required by 13485?
That's interesting. There is a reference in the proposed document. I'm surprised I didn't talk about it, but yes, in the proposed document, they do talk about how ISO 13485 definition of a medical device file is versus what FDA's definition is. And they have acknowledged that ISO 3485 seems to be all encompassing. So additional clarity perhaps is awaited. We are expecting that they will accept the contents of a medical device file, maybe provide additional guidance on what they absolutely do want to see, but that's still not clear. They do talk about providing clarity though.
Okay. Well, I don't think I heard you say this, but will the FDA require ISO 13485 certification? Would certification to 13485 reduce the number of manufacturer FDA audits?
I think both can be interpreted. It's an interpretation again. They do need to develop this QSIT further. They are recognizing ISO 13485 certification and notified bodies that are going to provide that. What I would say is that, does it take that away? I don't think so. Yeah.
I would agree. And then similar to that, will legacy devices that adhere to 820 be grandfathered in unless they go through significant changes? I think that's something a little different, perhaps.
It is, because like I said, 820 is not changing. What they're doing is providing a certain level of clarity and reference to ISO 13485. Harmonization usually is that way. I think it's certainly new for, it's going to be unique. I won't say new, it'll be unique experience for most of the US market. It is something that the European market has been very familiar with, because MDD was harmonized to ISO 13485 as EN ISO 13485, and that's what has been there. There is significant effort from a harmonization perspective for MDR in Europe to EN ISO 13485. So not yet there. They haven't done that yet, but it is something that they're proposing. So with the with an harmonization effort, what happens is your essence of 820 is not changing. What you've been meeting as a legacy device manufacturer to that requirement is not changing. What you're going to be doing is providing reference into your QMS with ISO 13485, where the linkages are. That's what you're doing. Or the impact on manufacturers is going to be.
It's and correct me if I'm thinking about this incorrectly. I think when maybe I and others think of harmonization, it's like a mirror. All right, we hear harmonization, we hear CFR, ISO, same thing. That's not quite the case. It's like you said, CFR is not changing, but there's more references to ISO 13485, more connective tissue, I guess, to be medical about it, maybe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's how you could think about it. Yes.
Perfect. Any negatives to this harmonization that you can foresee? Not to end it on a negative note. But
no, it's not a negative note at all. No, it's all positive. In fact, FDA has done a very good proposal with discussion from a financial impact perspective, from an economic impact perspective. They've also discussed what internal costs are going to be. That has been the only major discussion that we could think about from a standpoint of anything towards negative, I'll say, because everything so far is good. I mean, it's thumbs up, because we want harmonization. We want at a global level for there to be less burden from a paperwork perspective for manufacturers to be able to maintain open markets that way. The burden comes in to FDA, actually. Everything that we've talked about so far, there's actually going to be more work FDA has to do than manufacturers. They do have a certain dollar value that they've detailed out that they will be spending on training efforts and development of the QSIT and how they're going to continue doing audits, but with alignment with ISO 13485. So what we are expecting to see is a lot of those positives coming our way, where there's going to be less paperwork that a manufacturer is going to have to do to sell products in United States versus some of the other countries, because ISO 13485 makes it easy.
Think it's gonna get harder before it gets easier, but once it gets easier, hopefully we'll be okay. And you heard Deepa, she said, do not panic at this point. But well,
Yes,
Deepa,
it's
thank you so much for your time today. We actually have one more presentation starting, I believe, at the top of the hour. So go grab some lunch, come right back here. In the chat, I sent a survey to the 2023 State of the MedTech Industry survey that we have out right now. And apparently you can win a $100 gift card and donate to Project Cure. So that link is in the chat. Let us know if you have any questions. Deepa, thank you for your time
you.
today. And if you're hanging around for the next session, we will see you soon. All right. Bye,
I hope
everyone.
so. Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.